In this set of slides, we're going to talk about some psychological disorders that happen following brain damage. If you'll recall, in one of the earlier modules, we talked about a model of the mind, where the mind is like a Swiss Army knife. It's one tool, but it's got many different smaller tools that are very specialized for particular tasks. And that if you break one of those tools off, you lose that capacity, but the rest of the mind, or the rest of the Swiss Army knife, is still functional. That's sort of what we're going to be talking about here. So let me refresh your memory about how specifically things are located in the brain. We'll start with the example of language. Remember that language for most people is located in the left hemisphere of the brain, with speaking located in Broca's area and processing spoken language in Wernicke's area. Damage to the left hemisphere of the brain often results in some sort of language disorder, and these disorders are called aphasias. So whenever you see the word aphasia, you're talking about some sort of language problem, and there are several different types of aphasias. Broca's aphasia. A person with Broca's aphasia loses the ability, or at least has an impaired ability, to speak. In severe cases, the person may not be able to speak at all. They can still make noises and vocalizations of different sorts. They just can't use grammatically correct language. In less severe instances, the person may just have a disruption of the ability to speak, so they may develop a stutter or struggle with certain kinds of complicated language. But the inability to produce proper spoken language is known as Broca's aphasia, and it develops from damage in the left hemisphere in Broca's area. Similarly, Wernicke's aphasia is a loss of the ability to comprehend the spoken word. The person can hear perfectly all right. It's not that they lose auditory capacity. They just don't understand spoken language. It doesn't register with them. It's just a lot of sound. Even their own voice, if they were to speak into a tape recorder and record something and then play it back, it would just sound like gibberish to them. Alexia is a disruption of reading abilities. Reading is a language-related thing, and therefore it is located in the left hemisphere of the brain. Whenever you see the LEX in a word, like in dyslexia, it has to do with some difficulty with symbolic language rather than spoken language. Agraphia. This is a disruption of the ability to write. Anomia. This is kind of a funny one. You lose the ability to retrieve the names of things. So if somebody is looking at a light switch on the wall and they ask me, what's the name of that? I will struggle, and I will be able to tell them everything about it, that if you flip it up and down, the lights go on and off, but I can't retrieve the name of it. And if somebody says it's a light switch, you go, yes, light switch, but you still have trouble. It's like the dictionary where you retrieve words from has been damaged. Acalculia, an impairment of the ability to perform mathematical operations. When I used to teach statistics at Knox College, I swore that I would see an outbreak of this every time I taught the course. So, damage to the left hemisphere of the brain most frequently results in some sort of aphasia, some sort of language problem, or at least a disruption of the things that are located in the left hemisphere, like mathematical and language abilities. Damage to the right hemisphere often results in some sort of visual recognition problem. The person has difficulty identifying what it is they're actually looking at. And this also comes in a variety of different forms. General object agnosia, in its most severe case, makes it impossible for a person to look at anything and even know what it is they're seeing. They may be able to identify the thing if they feel it or explore it in other ways, but just by looking at it, they can't tell what it is. Now, some people have total object agnosia where they can't recognize anything, but can also be very weirdly specific. For example, finger agnosia. The person can't see or recognize the fingers on their own hand, but they may be able to identify other things. If you click on the link on this slide, you'll be able to see a person with object agnosia struggling with his situation. There are also other links on the web page to object agnosia individuals. Amusia is the inability to recognize tones or melodies, even if it's something you've heard hundreds of thousands of times in your life. Think of the tune to the song Happy Birthday to You. Everybody knows the song, but a person with amusia can't recognize it, and even if you play it over and over and over again, they don't have the ability to recognize it as a melody that they just heard minutes ago. Prosopagnosia is the inability to recognize individuals by their faces. You can recognize people by the sound of their voice, you might recognize their clothing, but their face doesn't register. You can't identify individuals just by looking at their face, even your own face. If you take a picture of an individual who has prosopagnosia and show them a picture of their own face, they can't recognize themselves. When you ask people what do they see, you get different kinds of responses. Some people say that they can see the face, they can see the eyes and the nose and the mouth, but somehow everybody's face looks the same to them. Some people don't really see the features very well, and the face is just sort of this blank blob of flesh with the features missing. Some other people have even reported that what they see is like a caricature of a face with a bulging eyeballs and a very long nose and all kinds of features that make it impossible to identify the individual. There are a couple of links on this slide that you can follow to see some people with this problem, but there are also some listed on the web page for this module. Movement agnosia is kind of a creepy one. The person has the inability to perceive motion, and this can play out a little differently from person to person. For some individuals, if something moves, it disappears. So if it's not a stable, stationary object, the person will not be able to see it. Other people kind of see things in a different way. For example, if I was pouring a pitcher of water into a glass and holding the pitcher high above the glass, a person with movement agnosia might report that they see sort of a frozen solid glacier stretching from the pitcher to the glass, but they wouldn't perceive any motion in the water. Astereognosia. The person cannot identify things by touch. If you put something in a box and have the person reach in and feel the object in the box, but they can't see it, it could be a very easily identifiable common object like a key or a dice or something that anybody would be able to tell by feel, a pencil. They will not be able to do it if they have astereognosia. Neglect syndrome is kind of a creepy one. A person with neglect syndrome loses the ability to see anything on the left side of their visual world. So if I were standing looking out at a crowd of people in a classroom, I would only see the people on the right side of the classroom. I would only eat the food on the right side of my plate. I would only shave the right side of my face. And the person is completely unaware that there's anything wrong. There's a link to an article describing neglect syndrome that you can find on this page. And if you find this interesting, I would suggest you download it and take a look at it. Here's an example of some drawings by a person with neglect syndrome. They were presented with the pictures on the left side, the clock, the house, and the flower, and they were asked to draw what they saw. And what you see on the right side of the page are the copies of the artwork from the patient looking at the pictures. And as you can see, the left side of each one of the pictures is either missing or missing a lot of stuff. And the individuals looked at what they drew and they thought it looked just fine. They didn't see any problem with the pictures they'd drawn. Kluver-Bucy syndrome is pretty rare. It results from destruction of parts of both temporal lobes, but it does happen. And a person with Kluver-Bucy syndrome may have a variety of different syndromes. Most people probably won't have all of the things that I'm going to show you, but some combination of them. Hypersexuality. This essentially means the person walks around in a state of perpetual sexual arousal. It might sound pleasant, but I'm here to tell you it's not. A lack of emotion or a disruption of correct emotional responses. They may laugh when they're supposed to cry, or they just are inappropriately expressing emotion. Compulsive oral exploration. This is just a fancy way of saying that they put everything in their mouth. And I apologize for the slide being a little out. The spacing isn't quite right there. Psychic blindness. This is just a different word for visual agnosia, which we talked about in a previous slide. Okay, let's talk about Milner syndrome. Don't worry about Korsakoff syndrome, which I've got listed at the top of the slide. It's a very similar set of symptoms. It's completely lacking the ability to get new information into long-term memory. If any of you saw the old movie Memento, they're using a person who allegedly has this disorder as the star of the show. It's completely unrealistic. A person would not be able to function at all. Nothing like the guy in the movie was. But Milner syndrome actually was identified first by a guy named Milner, who had a patient who had been a fencer, a guy who does the athletic competition with swords, and he had been injured in a fencing accident where his opponent had lunged and his sword broke, snapped in half, and then his momentum carried the jagged edge of the broken sword through the guy's mask and up his nose and into his brain. And he pulled the sword out, and at first it didn't look like anything serious had happened. The guy who had gotten the sword up his nose did not lose consciousness or show any other visible symptoms, but it quickly became clear there was a problem. This person never again was able to put any new information into his memory. His doctor, Dr. Milner, would come in and see him and say, "Hello, I'm Dr. Miller. How are you today?" And they would have a nice conversation that lasted a couple of minutes, and Milner would walk out of the room and come back a few minutes later, and they would have the same conversation over and over and over again. It's a completely debilitating disorder. One of the most famous cases of this is a guy named Clive Wearing, who was a British musician who was very well known in the music world. He was quite eminent at the time where he was affected by this. And the video clip that you can see by clicking on this link or by going to the webpage and getting the link will graphically illustrate the problem.